Morning. This morning we're going to be in Psalm 78. That's going to be the text this morning. We're going to break down Psalm 78 and some of the major lessons from it. Psalm 78 begins with, "Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us." Psalm 78 is not a messianic psalm, meaning it is not a psalm talking about Jesus. It is a psalm that is considered one of the historical psalms. And as you go through it, that's exactly what it does, is it covers history, specifically the history of Israel. And yet, Psalm 78 is quoted in reference to Jesus. Specifically, verse 2, "I will open my mouth in a parable." It's quoted in Matthew 13, verse 35, when Jesus speaks to the people and teaches them in parables. Here's the thing. Psalm 78 is quoted as saying, hey, this is a fulfillment. But what Jesus does has really nothing to do with Psalm 78 except for one thing. Psalm 78 is a lesson from God in a parable. And so when Jesus came down and he uttered and taught wisdom the same way his Father teaches wisdom, in parables. A parable is simply this. You take something that is understandable, something that we can get and appreciate for what it is, and we throw it alongside something that we struggle to understand. And Psalm 78 does that. The parable, however, is not the same kind of parable like what Jesus did, where Jesus told parables that were a hypothetical situation or a generic situation. There was a man who was walking through a field. Or if a shepherd loses one sheep and has 99 that stay, what does he do? It's not like the parable of the sower, where there's this generic picture of a man going out to sow seed. The parable, the story that you can understand, that's thrown alongside something that is hard to understand, is an actual historical account. The parable of Psalm 78 deals with a generational problem, one that all of us recognize and we've all seen. And that is that when you look, one generation does not necessarily mean the next generation will be like it. Because the worst generation of Israelites, the ones that came out of Egypt, saw all the miracles, all the signs, ended up not taking the promised land. And God said, you are idolatrous, you are faithless, and so that entire generation had to die in the wilderness. And yet, the worst generation, what did it produce in the next generation? Arguably the best generation that Israel had ever seen. So they go from the people that are so bad, so foul, so faithless, that God says, I'm not taking you into the promised land, I'll take your kids. And then the kids go in, and that generation is amazing. They put all of their trust in God. They march around the walls of Jericho. They learn the lessons of the failures of Ai. They rout the northern kings and the southern kings and take over the whole land. And then, that generation, which is arguably the best generation, produced what? They produced a worthless generation of Israelites. And this is the generational problem. How is it that the best can make the worst and the worst can make the best? It doesn't seem to work the way that we would like it to, which is that we want our children to stand on the shoulders of us so that there is a continual pattern of, if I was faithful, my children would be more faithful. And their children would be even more faithful still. That we would build a legacy of faith in God. What we often see is the exact opposite. And so the parable of Psalm 78 is the history of Israel. So I want you to understand that what God is doing is He's taking one thing that we can see what happened to Israel, and we can understand it, and throws it up alongside our lives and our problem that we want the next generation to be better than the one before it, not worse. If you look in Psalm 78, verse 5 through 7, he'll say, He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments. The plan all along, the plan that God has always had, would be that there would be a positive momentum, that each generation would learn from the one before it, and so that the children would be at least as faithful as mom and dad. Arguably, the hope would be better. Right? We want better for our children than we have for ourselves. And that then the grandchildren would be even better still. And yet, here's the thing. We see instead a very broken cycle that happens most of the time. Psalm 78 is asking the question, and asking us to ask the question, can that cycle be broken? Or are we just forced, as we raise our children, to expect that if we're faithful, our kids will be not, and that maybe after they're not, maybe their kids will be, and we have this back and forth and back and forth. Now, I say all that so that you understand, as we go through Psalm 78, what we're really trying to do is understand what went wrong. And he hints at it in the first verse 5 through 7. God established a testimony which He commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them. We're in the quarter of love the Lord your God with all your mind. The process of teaching the next generation is a mental exercise. It's not only a mental exercise, but it is absolutely a mental engagement. So that we would understand some principles, understand them in our mind, so that we can then apply them to teaching our children, whether those be your specific kids. Maybe you are in the child-rearing years and you are thinking, I want my kids to have a faith in God that is their own and is better than me. I want them to love Him more than I love Him. I want the next generation to be better. I certainly don't want an Israelite pattern. Or if we are thinking in terms of how is it that we can help other people in the family of God? Because as the congregation here at Eastland, we are the family. And we're looking to make sure that the next generation is better than the last. Because in the same way that families oftentimes die out because things don't get passed down to the next generation, you see the same pattern with churches. The 7 churches of Asia that you find in the book of Revelation, they're not there anymore. Because at some point, there was a generational gap. At some point, there became a broken cycle. And Eastland, as good as we've got it right now, and truly, we've got it so good, that is a gift we ought not to take for granted. We need to make sure that those who are coming up, that as the generational momentum continues, those who come after know the Lord. So what are the patterns? What are the things that Psalm 78 emphasizes that led really to the demise, that generational problem, the generational parable of Psalm 78? Well, down in verse 9 and 10, he'll say, the Ephraimites, that's a particular tribe, armed with the bow, turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant, but refused to walk according to His law. It's an interesting thing. The Ephraimites were known for being some of the best warriors of all the tribes. And so they are armed with the bow. This tribe that they know, they have the skill set of hunting and archery. And so when it comes time for battle, you think about all of the different tribes. Here's one that should be really good at it. When it comes time to actually go to battle, they've got all of the skills. And yet, what happens? The Ephraimite, though armed with the bow, turns back. They fail. They turn back on the day of battle. They don't keep God's covenant. I will tell you right now that there is plenty of time to equip our children with skills, we must first equip our children with character. Look, we live in Kentucky. It is the land of Colonel Sanders. And that man invented this amazing recipe and industry in his later years. Right? He wasn't Colonel Sanders at 20. He's Colonel Sanders at 70. Like, we know him as the white-haired guy. You can figure out a business. You can figure out a resume. You can figure out and gain a skill set later in life. You can go back to college and gain some certifications you don't have. You can figure that stuff out later in life. But you know what's a lot harder to do later in life? Change your character. Now, it can be done, and we know it does, but it's not often. Look, we live in a country and we live in a time with so much abundance of educational options. And I'm a fan of that. I love all of that. I love the opportunities that our kids have to gain ability that other parts of the world and other times in history never had. But I will tell you, your kid can have 14 doctorates. And if they don't have character, they're worthless to the world. And we've been told the most important thing to do when they're young is make sure to put that education in there. Make sure that they learn all of these book academic things. That's the most important thing. And I'm going to argue it isn't. I'm not saying pull your kids out of school and never teach them anything. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying prioritize as a parent. This is your mental understanding, is that if I have to choose between my child learning something that will improve their character and them learning facts in a book, which a person with character would use well, but a person without character would use abominably. Always choose character. Always choose, because ability is not the same thing as commitment. And I will also say this is true even with Bible knowledge. I want to be careful with this because I don't want anybody to walk away saying, Scott thinks Bible knowledge isn't important. That's not at all what I'm saying. The Bible is our window into God. It is His Word. It is the most precious gift, aside from the blood of Jesus, that we have been given. But if your kid can quote all of the different books of the Bible, and they can answer all of the Bible trivia, but they do not know how to apply it in their own life, we have failed them. Our job is not to teach our kids to become the best Bible Jeopardy students. Again, I'm not saying those don't matter. I'm not saying there's no value to that. But at some point, we need to make sure that we are teaching them the character that is found in the Word, not just the words on the page. And I think most people know the difference. And it's important that we convey those things to the next generation. Psalm 78, verse 8, back up just one verse in the psalm. A generation that did not prepare its heart and whose spirit was not faithful to God. If we fill the mind, but leave the mind alone without the heart being prepared, without the soul being devoted to God, then we will have missed it. You know, the world is full of people who grew up in a religious background and know lots of facts about the Bible, but do not understand how that applies to their relationship with Jesus. And that's what I'm telling you need to make sure happens. It's not an either or. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. Some of us. You probably can. But the idea of, can I learn the Bible facts and then also learn how to live those facts? Right? It's important that your children learn things like Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. But then, when your kid is out there in real life and they make a promise to do something for somebody and then something more exciting comes up, ever have that happen? I told so-and-so I would go over and help them, but I didn't know there would be this fun thing all my buddies were doing. Now's where you've got to decide. Are you going to teach them to know the verse, yes means yes, and no means no? Or are you going to teach them to know the verse? Your yes means yes, and your no means no. Because if you don't put it in the core of them, it's academic. And it's not commitment. Ability without commitment is not enough. The second thing is, as you go through Psalm 78, there is this massive list of things that God did for the generation that ended up dying in the wilderness. He wrought wonders, meaning He performed all of these miraculous signs. He divided the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea, and they walked through on dry ground. And their enemies are destroyed in the floods of the Red Sea while they walk out victorious on the other side, saved from Egypt. He led them through the wilderness with a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night, so that they were, as a people, they knew He took them everywhere they needed to go. He provided for their needs when they had water and they were in need of it, even when they kind of were complaining about it. What does God do? He splits the rocks and pours forth the water, and the people drink. He brought forth streams for them to satisfy and refresh themselves from. He made the manna for them. And yet Psalm 78 verse 18 says that after He'd given them all those things, including when describing the manna, it even says, the bread from angels. Best meal ever, bread from angels. It says in Psalm 78 verse 18, and in their heart they put God to the test by asking food according to their desire. Here is a truth that we have all seen in small children, but it is not true in small children. The problem is we think it ends when they stop being little kids. It doesn't. It doesn't end when you're 45. When you are given abundance over and over and over again, it oftentimes leads you to just wanting more. So here's God, and He takes them out of Egypt, and He parts the Red Seas, and He leads them in the wilderness, and He gives them water to drink, and He gives them food to eat. And so they're all abundantly grateful, and they say, God, whatever you want, we'll do. Is that what happens? No. They complain, and they say, we only have bread. We would like meat. He gives them water one time. The next time they get thirsty, well, where's the water, God? There is a sad reality that we as human beings have a tendency to, when we have much, we just want more. You see it in little kids all the time. A spoiled little kid, we even use the term spoiled, right? Like milk. They have been given and given and given. And does it improve their character? No. And it doesn't just happen to little kids, right? You have people in their 40s, and they've been given, and they've been given, and they've been given. What happens? They test by asking according to their desires. We want more. There is an insatiability to desire, and we just have to understand it as part of humanity, is that when you're given things, it will really never be enough. It doesn't matter how many meals, it doesn't matter how much entertainment, it doesn't matter how much money, it doesn't matter how many compliments. You'll never get to a point where you say, look, I've just had enough of all of those things. Please, never, ever, ever another meal again. I'm done. I don't want to see another dollar again a day in my life. I've just had enough. We never get to that point. There's always room for more. And so we need to understand a truth. Children who receive blessings without being taught to honor the source will only worship their craving. And that doesn't stop when they're kids. You probably have found, even in your own soul, the same thing sometimes. That you live in a time of abundance, where there is so much. And if you have not taken the time to give God thanks for it, and honor Him as the source of all those blessings, if you kind of get off track and forget that God is the source of every good and perfect gift, and you just kind of get used to the good stuff coming in, there comes a point where all of a sudden you have to realize, oh, I have a new idol in my life. It's called craving. Whatever I crave right now is what I want. And so as we look from one generation to the next, we need to understand that just giving them more is not the answer. It won't. And the danger with it oftentimes is this principle is least understood by the best generations. Because oftentimes the best generations, guess what? They know what it's like to not have much. They know starvation and poverty and hard work and no guarantees of success. And so they have cherished every blessing themselves, and they assume the next generation will do exactly like they did. If you are providing a better life for your children than you had, guess what? You need to understand they will not enjoy and honor the source of that blessing the way that you do. Because they don't know what it's like to not have it. A good day is baseline for them. Having all they want, eating out, enjoying the good things of life, that's baseline for them. Peace, prosperity, a roof over their head. Maybe you went without those things. They haven't. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying, well, kids out in a tent tonight. What I'm saying is that it has to be cultivated. You have to cultivate an attitude of honoring the source. I was talking to an older preacher one time, and he has done very well with his kids. Done very well. And I will say that is sadly not the norm. There's a reason, they talk about PK kids, preacher kids, and oftentimes that is not a positive statement. But this gentleman had done really well. And he and I were talking about it because I'm in the child raising years, and he is, his kids are grown, and he has a track record of success. And he said, funny thing, he goes, I was talking to an older guy. So this guy, he was older. The guy he was talking to was like Methuselah, whoever it was. But he had the same kind of conversation that I was having with him. And he said, and this guy said to me, he said, look at the preachers around. And he listed a bunch of different preachers that I knew as kind of the old timer. He's like, how many of them did well? And the sad truth is not many of them did well in raising their kids. They were great evangelists, but not really great at raising their kids. And he said, now think about these guys. And he listed some other ones, and he said, how did they do? And I go, oh, well, they did really, really well. In fact, one of the reasons I know they did really, really well is a lot of their kids are the people that I know and respect now. I don't really know the dad, but I know the kids. And he said, this older guy said, those ones that did well, you know what? That one thing they had in common? The dads went and preached at hard places. Not always, but at times they went and preached at hard places. And there's something to that. Your kids have never known hardship. If they've never known what it's like to do hard work for the Lord, and they've never seen their parents do it, you're not cultivating that sense of honor of the source of all blessing. When you do hard things, your kids learn to do hard things because you take them along with you. And so that is my advice to you, is to look at hard things that Christians could do. Maybe it is. You say, look, my family, we're going to go do foreign work for 2 weeks. I'm going to take my family with me. Or maybe it's, we're going to get involved in doing some things in the congregation that need to be done, and we're going to make some sacrifices as a family to make those things done. But no matter what it is, do hard things. Because when your kids see that easy is not always guaranteed, they begin to honor the source, and the cravings have less of a chance of becoming an idol. The third thing is, when we suffer, we seek. It's just true. Psalm 78 says a very uncomfortable thing in verse 34 and 35. that is God, when God killed them, they sought him. They repented and sought God earnestly. They remembered that God was their rock, the Most High God, their Redeemer. I will tell you, I don't particularly like that verse. When he killed them, they sought him. If you back up and look in the context of that, what it actually is talking about is they would sin against God, and there were consequences for the sin. And so what God would do is the strongest, the choicest, the most skilled of the people were oftentimes killed off. And what the rest of them learned is, hey, God's serious. When we suffer, we learn to seek God. When things are always good, we don't. And so something else that we should understand is that as much as we don't desire our kids to suffer, it is one of the most potent drivers of growth and remembrance of God. Whether that be suffering while they're doing hard things or suffering the consequences of their choices. When your kid does something wrong, there's this part of you that absolutely wants to rationalize it and fix it for them. Because you want life to be good for them, and I get that. And I'm not speaking as somebody who does it perfectly. There have been many, many times that I have saved my children from consequences that I look back later and I go, oh man, I shouldn't have. And one of the ways I knew that I shouldn't have is the mistake they made that they should have suffered the consequence for, they ended up making it again because they didn't suffer any consequence for it. Whether we like it or not, repentance typically happens at the bottom of the barrel. It happens when you've dug to as deep in the hole as you can get and you hit bedrock. There has to be consequences and an understanding of the consequences of sin, or we don't change. Repentance is a change of mind. Why would I change what I'm doing if it doesn't hurt me? And so in parenting, we have to understand that. We also have to understand that as the Lord's body. It doesn't come up too often, but there are circumstances in which there is church discipline. When the church has to say, look, the life that you're living is not right with God, and it must be addressed. And the New Testament describes that as delivering such a one to Satan for the salvation of their soul in the end. You notice that? You deliver them over to Satan. Let them live with the consequences of that for a while, with the desire of the salvation of their soul in the end. If we want a generation that will seek the Lord, we have to understand that there will have to be some suffering in that process. Fourth thing, people are fickle and require restraint. And no, I don't mean restrain them. That's not people are fickle, so restrain them. No, the pattern actually in Psalm 78 is the restraint of God. If you look in down to verse 38, this is one of several places this theme shows up. Yet he, being compassionate, atoned for their iniquity and did not destroy them. He restrained his anger often and did not stir up all his wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and comes not again. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. One of the things that we're told in God's dealing with the generation is that when they sinned, yes, they suffered for it, but not as much as they deserved. God would unleash his wrath on them, but not totally. He would restrain his anger. And this is also important for us to understand, is that if we're going to deal with people, guess what? People are going to make mistakes. And then tomorrow, they're probably going to make it again. And how many times did Jesus say that you should forgive your brother? 70 times 7. There's a pattern of just understanding how people are. And you do this with yourself all the time. You will do something dumb, and then you get up the next morning and you let yourself do something dumb again. And in fact, sometimes for years and years and years, you struggle with the same dumbness over and over and over again, and yet you don't give up on yourself. And even if you tell me, oh, I gave up on myself, you're breathing. You have not given up on yourself. But with other people, we oftentimes do. They do something wrong, and we do not restrain our anger. We go, that's it, I'm wiping them out. I'm done with that person. That's not how families work. And Eastland, if we're going to be a family, one of the things that we have to understand is that we're going to irritate each other from time to time. And we're all going to show off our dumbness from time to time. And if we don't restrain ourselves with each other, it won't work. And as you're parenting your children, guess what? Your kids are going to make choices, and you're going to shake your head, and you're going to say, why are you behaving like that? And then your wife will turn and say, wasn't that what you did at that age? And then you're going to say, I didn't want to hear that. And a whole other conversation. But that's the reality of people. People are messy. Children will make the same mistakes repeatedly, and adults will too. So what's your job? What's the lesson from the parable of Psalm 78? What did God do with people who sinned repeatedly and made all sorts of mistakes and did the same things over and over again? He restrained his anger. He was patient and consistent. Throughout every generation, God's the same God. Throughout every situation, God's the same God. And that's how we should parent our children. That's how we should act as the Lord's people. Measured responses are best. We don't solve anything by flying off the handle. We don't solve anything by giving up on people. Instead, what we do is we say, no matter what others do, I will be measured in my response. Because I understand people are going to people. And they're going to do the things that you would expect people to do. And then the fifth thing is, you go down to the very end of it. The very end of Psalm 78, down in verse 70 and through 72. And after looking at these historical examples of the broken generation and the cycles that didn't work out the way they ought to, it says, he chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds, from following the nursing ewes. He brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people, Israel, his inheritance, with an upright heart. He shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. One of the things that we see is, ultimately, as God tried to get Israel as a nation to be more and more faithful, the best rulers at doing that were people like David. And what does David do? David comes from shepherding sheep, and then what does he do? God says, I'm raising him up to shepherd people. And we have an image of that in the church. What is it that God appoints in local congregations? He appoints elders, and they are shepherds. They don't drive the herd. They're not a bunch of cowboys, but they shepherd. They lead with a biblical model. And on top of that, Psalm 78 ends with saying, well, how do you break the cycle? Well, what God did is he appointed to David. And guess what? Who does David point us toward? The chief shepherd. The one who's of the house of David. See, God's model for leadership has always been shepherding. That's why before a man can shepherd the household of God, he has to have shown himself good at shepherding his own household. And so, shepherding is God's model for leadership. And shepherding is very different than what we're used to in an industrialized age. You're dealing with animals, and that requires skill. Some of it's almost more art than skill even. The ability to look and pay attention and to know how the animals are doing. The shepherd is trustworthy enough that the sheep want to follow him. He doesn't typically drive from the back of the herd. When most pictures of you see shepherds moving herds from one place to another, they are almost always moving them from the front. They have attentive concern for the needs of others. Do you know how you break the generational model? You don't just worry about your faith. You don't just worry about you. You think about your kids. You think about others in the congregation. You think about how you can set a good example. And you put the effort in. Biblically, it's It's always been this idea of the generation ahead leading from the front so that the next generation wants to follow. And so that means you've got to have the character first. It's interesting with David. Before David was made king by the people loved him. Saul was really big on enforcing his might. David, on the other hand, just went out and fought Goliath, and people said, look at this guy, he's killed his 10,000. The greatest thing you can do for the next generation is make sure that you are working out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And then don't do that in a bubble. Don't leave your kids behind. Make sure that you're taking them with you on that journey. At this time, as we head into the invitation song, we give you an invitation to become a Christian, to follow the chief shepherd Jesus. If you are not yet a Christian, he wants you to be a part of his fold. If we can help you to be baptized into Christ, wait no longer as we stand and sing to come to Jesus.